Okay, I see that we're being recorded. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the March 30th virtual planning board meeting, a first for us in the brave new world. We are here primarily for the topic of talking about the town board's consideration of new amendment to the zoning law and the creation of what's called the CCR floating zone. CCR stands for, I always get that messed up. CCR is Conservation Cluster Residential Floating Zone. So that's what we're here to talk about tonight. I'd like to welcome all our guests. Noreen, can we start with a roll call, please?
Don Allegro,
Here.
Jeff Manson,
Here.
Lisa McQuaid,
Actually, if you have the board members on mute.
Yeah, I was just unmuting everyone.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Noreen, if we can continue with the roll call.
Lisa, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, say here, please.
here.
Anthony Vaccaro,
Here.
Jason Sorinsky,
Present.
and we have a new member I'd like to welcome, Pat Shea.
I'm here.
Thank you.
Terrific. For purposes of our meeting, since you're all participating from your homes, please locate the fire exits nearest to you. I'm sure you're most familiar with them more than I am. Mine is to the right. There is a door, and behind me there is a stairway. You do you.
Sorry, I forgot to take that off.
If everyone can please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, so now we've all tested our various broadband speeds. So I am the acting chair of the planning board, for those of you listening or watching at home. Our regular planning board chair, Bonnie, is not participating. She has recused herself from this meeting and this subject because it was her planning firm, she works for a planning firm, that actually worked on this DGEIS that we're discussing tonight and the CCR floating zone concept. So I've been asked to run the meeting tonight with, and this is a discussion again of that. For, I guess I'd like to begin, if we could, with Ashley, if you would, please explain to the rest of the board members a little bit about what it is we're trying to accomplish here tonight in being able to provide feedback to the town board on this CCR concept.
Sure. So can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So right now, the town board is in the secret review process. So where they are is, as you know from doing other secret reviews on different projects, they're now in the DGEIS stage. So it's the draft environmental impact statement. So they already had a scoping session where they went over with the public, I believe, what impacts they needed to study for this new law. And now they've prepared, or the planners prepared this document known as the DGEIS. So normally it's a DEIS. A DGEIS is similar, but it's the type of environmental impact statement that's used when you have a local law, zone change, a lot of times comp plans, things like that, that are applicable to more than one specific site, or could potentially apply to more than one specific site. So the purpose of this meeting is really for the board to discuss the law, and any comments you may have collectively as a board that you would want me to report back to the town board. So it's not spelled out in the regulations as far as the scope of what you could be, speaking to, but you want to give substantive comments, things that are going to impact, you from a planning board standpoint. So if there's something in there you think that would impact the planning board's review, that should maybe be said differently. Any type of impact you think that might have to the planning board, then we could, if the board collectively agrees, we could go ahead and put that in a report. Basically, that's why you're here tonight. If there's any questions or anything, we could go over that as well.
Thank you, Ashley. So for the members of the public that are joining us, and just so we're on the same page, quickly, the CCR floating zone concept, it would be a addition to our zoning law that would allow the town board, when a developer asks for consideration, to place a special zone over certain parcels of land within the town. There's 80 parcels, as memory serves, that have been designated as possibly eligible for this floating zone. When the law would be enacted, it wouldn't actually grant this status to those parcels, but an applicant would have to meet certain criteria in and amongst the size of the parcels. It has to be a minimum of so many acres and contiguous and that sort of thing. And then they could come with a master development plan before the town board and say, we'd like for you to consider this type of zoning. The most unique feature of this type of zone, if the town board decided to actually do what's called land the zone, actually grant authority for a developer to use this type of zoning, is that 65% of the total property would have to be set aside in a conservation easement and left as undeveloped. The remaining 35%, they would be able to develop at a higher density than what would normally be allowed in the various zones that are existing on these various properties. They did select a test site as part of the DGEI's process. Instead of looking at every single property, they had to pick a section of the properties to do the environmental study on as a representative sample for all of the studies. So that's what we're discussing tonight. I'd like us to kind of break down our discussion into 3 sections. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is our responsibilities as a planning board regarding the CCR approval process. Then I'd like to talk more generally about the CCR concept and what our thoughts are about that. And then finally, specifically, feedback on the test site. Why that's particularly important is, so based on the environmental study that's being done on the test site, if a developer at some point in the future came back to the town board and wanted to develop on what is the test site in this DGEIS and what will be the FGEIS, then as long as they were only building up to the levels that were used as the example, then no further environmental study needs to be done. It's only if they're looking to exceed those levels in the number of units or the density or the usage or the traffic or any of those things that they would have to go back and study that further. Any of the other properties that are eligible for this CCR floating zone designation would have to go through the full process. So I'd like to spend a little time talking about our thoughts about the test site, because when this FGEIS is all said and done, that property is effectively settled, again, assuming that they stay within those limits that were studied. So if I may begin our conversation around our responsibilities regarding the CCR approval process, I wanted to just go over, based on the verbiage from the proposed law as it stands right now, it's still subject to modification at this point because it hasn't been finally approved, if it will be approved. But this would be our involvement in this. And so we're starting with section B, labeled application procedure and approval process. And subsection 5 is the requirement for the referral to the planning board as part of a developer requesting this designation. The town board must refer to us for our input as well, kind of like we do with a GML referral to Orange County. And so that subsection reads, after the town board has determined the application is a viable project that wishes to consider for the CCR floating zone, it shall refer the application to the planning board. In the case of such a referral, the planning board shall submit its report on the proposed petition to the town board within 60 days of receipt of a referred petition. Such referral shall include the proposed petition, master development plan, and a negative declaration of environmental significance or an environmental impact statement pursuant to 6 NYCCR 617. The planning board shall review the petition and master development plan against the criteria in subsection C, the intent of the CCR floating zone, and the goals and objectives of subsection A in regarding whether to authorize the CCR floating zone. The planning board shall also review the layout of the master development plan, as well as the scale and intensity of proposed development. The planning board shall recommend whether the MDP, the master development plan, should be approved with modifications, or denied, and is encouraged to provide recommendations on how the master development plan can be improved in order to incorporate the best practices of sustainable land development. Now that's the end of 5B, but also within the body of the law at various points it includes, the law also requires the town board consider our report as part of the decision to approve, deny, or approve with conditions for request of the CCR designation. Also, as a standard condition of the CCR authorization, a site plan application must be submitted to the planning board within 6 months of the approval of the CCR designation. As a standard condition of approval as well, the homeowners association certificate of incorporation, bylaws, and declaration of restrictions shall be submitted to the planning board as well as the town attorney for approval. We shall require the applicant, we, the planning board, shall require the applicant, that public improvements, recreational facilities, and landscaping be secured by a performance guarantee in the same manner as prescribed in the town subdivision regulations, or as the planning board may require. If the master development plan include that the property be composed of single-family detached homes on fee simple lots in a subdivision, that subdivision would be subject to planning board approval as well. There's quite a bit of involvement that we have an opportunity to have both on the town board's approval or denial of whether to go forward with an actual piece of property as designated with the CCR floating zone. And then again, once it's been done, in the final approval of that before it gets to the building department for their approvals. So who has any thoughts or concerns about that, about our involvements with this process? Anyone? So one of the questions I guess I had as I was going through it was, what's the board's general feeling on the 60-day time frame? That once it comes to us from the town board, do we feel that 60 days would give us a sufficient amount of time to provide that feedback? Anyone?
Jeff, it's Lisa. 60 days doesn't sound like a lot. Doesn't sound like it would be enough. I mean, it's 2 meetings. And then if we, like we have now, we're in essence missing a meeting. If you miss a meeting, you really only have 1 meeting to decide. So that's a really good point you brought up.
It might be, at best, it's, we have a couple of workshops and a couple of meetings in there. And,
well, maybe it's better to make it 90 days. I mean, it's not pushing it off too far, but at least it gives a little more wiggle room for regardless of who needs to get more information, whether we need more time or the applicant needs more time. Because a lot of times when people come to us, we don't just look at them, say everything's great. Well, a lot of times we ask for more information. So 60 days really only gives them, come to one meeting and then come to the next meeting, and then 60 days is done.
Well, one thing I would say about that is, and Ashley could correct me if I'm wrong, but unlike a normal applicant coming before us, we're receiving a submission from the town board once they've received it from the applicant, and once they feel it's ready for us, they're sending it to us for that referral period. And whatever's been submitted to us is what we have to look at. That we don't have an opportunity necessarily to go back to the applicant or the town board with questions or for further information. We could in the end of the process say we don't feel we had enough information and request further information. We had a recent referral out to somebody that came back like that, where they felt they needed more information before they could make a determination. Ashley, what's the story with that?
So you're correct that you're basically being referred the petition by the town board, which of course it won't get to you until it's going to be complete. So once the town board has everything they need and is already decided that they want to pursue it. I actually do have a question, and I know, Jeff, you were involved in this process as far as your familiarity with this CCR, and I just wasn't really clear to me about seeker and how that's going to be done, because they say in here that it's going to get to the planning board when after they've either made a neg deck or there's going to be an EIS. So at the same time, the planning board is going to be an involved agency from the point of either the site plan or the subdivision. So I'm just trying to figure out, and it may be something that needs maybe more clarity here, is that before it gets formally referred to you, are you already going to be commenting based on your involved agency status as part of the seeker review? Because that might then, eliminate some of the concerns with the time frame. But it's just not clear to me. But again, I'm not that familiar with the whole law. So if you have anything to offer on that, or if you think it's also.
So, yeah, it doesn't, from what I've read in the law, it doesn't speak further to that. Although, yeah, it does sort of allude to, yes, when a developer comes forward, just like now, and in relation to the test site, there's a number of involved agencies, and the DGEIS is being referred out to them as well for their input. That would happen in this situation too. So yeah, we may see some of that prior to when everything is complete and the town board turns it over to us for our, right. So it might be a final input that we're giving at that point, but we've had enough opportunity at just being an involved agency that submissions will have been coming through to us. I hadn't really considered that, frankly. How does the rest of the board feel about 60 days versus 90 days, or maybe another time frame? Anyone?
Because I mentioned it, if I could, I was a little confused then. I mean, so we're basically going to be getting what the town board has already approved. So it's just for our review. I mean, I thought that we were the ones approving this, so I wasn't sure.
Okay, so it's two separate things. The part of the process that we're talking about now with the six, and where it's currently in the laws, we have a 60-day period to advise the board, is after the board has collected the town board has collected all the information they need from the developer that they feel needs to make a decision on that. It comes out to us for referral, and then our feedback goes to the town board, and then the town board, using that and other criteria, will make a final decision on whether to approve and do what's called land the zone by saying, yep, these properties are eligible for that and we approve that, or they may deny it. It's if they approve it, then either as a site plan or, depending on how they're going to develop it, as a subdivision, or possibly both, it's going to come to us to go through our normal planning board process.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But
So the 60 days
what's going to come to us, what's going to come to us at that point is the master development plan, which then we will work through to make sure that everything meets the code on site plans and everything meets the code on subdevelopments. You would like to think that most of that would be between our feedback, the town board taking them through their approval process, that if it gets to that, there won't be a lot necessarily for us to do, or as much, again, as a normal application coming to us fresh from the start.
Okay.
Hey,
Thank you for clarifying. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Jeff, I'm under the impression that, from what you read, that the planning board takes an advisory role, not an approval role in this process.
That is absolutely correct.
All right. So what you just said, though, kind of doesn't jive with that.
Contradicts that. Because if, in relation to the town board approving the actual use of this zoning, we take an advisory role. Once they've approved it, then the site plan that the developer will use to actually do the build will come to us for approval. So we still have to take them through our regular approval process, whether it becomes site plan, whether it becomes subdivision, or a combination of the two.
Well, the idea of it, though, is that this is going to streamline the approval process. Am I correct?
Based on everything that I believe the town board is going to have to do in their approval process, I would think it would streamline our process in getting, in going through a site plan, because it's going to be a well-developed idea, and honestly, not for nothing, we'll have already had an opportunity to have input into that.
So, in the sense that for this part of the process where you're taking an advisory role, I think that 60 days is pretty much double, what other, for example, like for a 239, that's a 30-day turnaround. So 60 days, I think, is quite a bit.
I'll jump in. I think the 60-day period is perfectly fine. And it's 30 days, that goes to people whose full-time job it is to watch what's going on in neighboring communities. So Orange County, they have a department of planning to review this stuff. The Village of Monroe, they have somebody who reviews this stuff. The Village of Harmony has somebody who gets this and they review this stuff. They get this stuff, and oftentimes it comes to us, 15 or 20 days already in.
That's what I was a little concerned about, was like if we're sending to Orange County Planning Board, planning department, right? They're there 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and we're going to be dealing with this as part of our other regular meetings when we're doing our other approvals and our other, determinations and all of that kind of thing. And as Lisa stated, in 60 days at best, we'll be able to discuss this 4 times.
Right. So
Depending on the initial date that it's submitted to us.
I don't like about being more as an advisor to the advisory roles. It feels like we're ceding a bit of power, and I get we still have to go through the full planning board approval process. It seems like we're giving more power that would normally be us to the town board, and I'm not like that. I think we need a division.
Well, remember, this is zoning law.
Oh, I know. I don't like the concept of floating zones and zoning law. I think they're ridiculous. I think it's just a way to spot something. That's a different issue.
Let's tackle, when we're talking about the CCR concept overall, let's explore that further. But for right now, I just kind of want to hold the conversation to process. The one thing that I guess I was a little concerned about, and only because I'm not clear on it, is, so what I couldn't tell is, does the planning board retain architectural review board authority if the CCR designation is granted by the town board? And the reason that I have that concern is this. Section B, subsection I of the proposed law states, conceptual elevations of proposed buildings in each use area and identification of general architectural or site design features necessary to ensure the community character or aesthetic character of the component use area identified in the master development plan. So if they're submitting architectural stuff as part of the concept for this master development plan, and the town board approves the CCR designation based on that, is the expectation that what was submitted to the town board is satisfactory for as far as architectural review goes, or will we have, as part of our process, the ability to use our authority as the town's architectural review board to further refine that concept? And frankly, honestly, I'm not really clear on that.
Can I
Ashley, do
interrupt
you
you for a
have
second?
Sorry, what's that?
Just wanted to interrupt you. I was wondering if people could put their mics on mute if they're not talking, because I think there's a lot of background noise, which is making my audio very fuzzy.
There is some of that. Yes, if we could ask that when you're not speaking or preparing to speak, that you turn your microphones off. There's a little mute button on your screen if you are, or if you're dialing in on the phone, maybe cover the speaking portion of your receiver just to cut down on the background noise. Thank you, Anthony. Ashley, do you have any insight on whether we would retain architecture review board authority in this situation?
So I think you're correct that it wasn't really that clear, because when it speaks about, if I recall, when it speaks about the planning board's subsequent review, I don't believe architectural was mentioned specifically. That's of course going to be part of your site plan or subdivision, normally in a larger type application like this, but it's something that if you want to include that, maybe ask as one of the comments to, specifically include that versus is whatever they're submitting for purposes of the elevations just going to be basically approved by the time it gets to you.
Right. So I guess as part of our feedback to the town board that's going to come out of this meeting, I'd just like for us to mention that as one of our questions, so that can be addressed as part of the FGEIS. They can kind of let us know that, and that'll also inform all the other members of the town whether we'll continue to have that authority in this situation. I would suspect we do, but again, unclear. Does anyone have any other thoughts, concerns, comments regarding our involvement in the process of the town board deciding to go forward with landing a CCR designation, or once it has been landed, what our involvement will be in the ultimate approval of a site plan or subdivision? I'd like to just get any of those issues taken care of, and then we'll move on.
Jeff, this is Anthony. Does the review include by the town board include public hearing, or that's up to the discretion in terms of applying the considerations?
Well,
I believe it does.
yeah. I believe
the answer is yes to that.
The answer is yes to that? Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, and certainly anytime environmental review is done, then public hearings are part of that process. So,
Or a local law that's going to be, ultimately it'll be by local law, which would also always require a public hearing also. I do think I read something specifically in here. I'm just trying to find it.
It's, section D, paragraph 1, Ashley.
Thank you.
one, public hearing. So yeah. So John, are you looking at that at the moment? Is that something you could just read us real quick?
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot here.
Upon receipt of a valid and complete application, including a negative declaration of environmental significance or a complete draft environmental impact statement, the town board shall set a date for and conduct a public hearing for the purpose of considering an amendment to the zoning map to quote land or designate the CCR floating zone district designating to the subject property. A public hearing shall be set by the town board within 30 days of receipt of the valid and complete application. If the town board elects to proceed with consideration of the petition, such public hearing shall be conducted within 60 days of receipt of the valid and complete application.
Okay, so that's a condition on the town that they have to conduct public hearings, and so that
Because they're going to be writing a local law.
that answers our concern there. So that's good.
And one quick question, would we have so prior to this town having their own site plan review on this matter, the land zone, would we also have to hold a public hearing on that as well?
No. No, within our 60-day. No, it's a remember, it's a referral to us.
So
We're
once
not because we're not making the decision. We're not holding public hearings on it.
right, but eventually it does come back to us, right? So we would still have to go through the regular subdivision or site plan approval public hearing?
Correct.
Okay,
At
so,
that point, now we're into public hearings in front of us because now when we go to vote, when we go to approve, yes, there will be public hearings.
gotcha.
There'll definitely be, you are required to have a public hearing on a subdivision, but for a site plan, it's in your discretion. So the board would decide to have.
And just listening to the board tonight, I suspect that if we're dealing with something coming to us based on the CCR floating zone, that we would probably need to do that, even if we were just talking about a site plan. It's a significant enough development in any case because of the acreage that I certainly would be in favor of that. And I imagine many of you would as well, based on our conversation tonight. Any other thoughts, concerns?
It's Lisa. I have a question. When you're reading Section D, Paragraph 1, I was only given the CCR, the DGEIS, as a PDF. So is what you're reading from, I know you started in the beginning reading from something, and then John just read us something. Where are you getting that information from?
Okay, so what happened was when I went to send that out, the file is too big. There's an amendments file to the DGEIS itself is 133 pages. The amendments are over 300 pages. So when I went to send that out, even trying to do it as an individual email, the file size is too big for the capacity of our email system. So
Okay.
in the email that I sent, I was referring people back to on the town website. You can pull those appendixes, and the first appendix is the current version of the law as written, again, subject to further modification by the board prior to approving it, but it's what we have to work with now. And it also includes things like the traffic study and all the other in-depth studies that went into being the background information to create the DGEIS. So
Thank you. I thought it was
where John and I
the
are
appendixes, but then you're mentioning it was used, a different word was used, so attachment maybe, so.
perhaps.
Which I didn't get an attachment, so I'm wondering, what that was. So it's the appendixes that you're talking about,
Correct.
like Appendix D, Paragraph 1
Yep.
is what John read from.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Other thoughts? Okay, so let's talk about our thoughts about this CCR concept in general. Again, without talking specifically to the test site, let's talk about how do we feel about this? Do we think this is a valuable addition to our zoning code? As it's proposed, do we like how it works to create zoning and an opportunity, or do we feel that it's not a positive thing for the town of Monroe? Jason, you had some thoughts on that. Would you like to begin our conversation tonight on that subject?
How would you like me to begin? So I have a bunch of issues with this thing. Number one is I feel, and then this is me also as a village resident now, I feel like there's a lot of strain on village resources such as the water or police. And I know that in Appendix D, the village police were not contacted, and as well as the traffic. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to have an additional, I think it was 250 some odd trips coming out of there, most of them are heading towards Reynolds, Rye Hill, and Mine Road, that lovely intersection.
Right.
I believe the mitigation measure there is satisfactory to the traffic that already exists there. I don't believe the mitigation measures that are at Orange Turnpike and Reynolds are satisfactory. And if there's an accident at either of those places, the state police, I mean, yeah, they'll show up because it's in New York, but it's the village police that are going to show up, and they weren't consulted on this at all. I'd also point out that, yeah, the village said there was a current water supply, but they just said, yeah, we have it, we can do it, and there were no metrics or data given. And that's something that I would have liked to see.
There was a little data given, but so you bring up an interesting point in relation to
I
that
feel like the
the
town gets a
possibility of
lot of
water
that.
and sewer, right? So the CCR concept does require sewer and central water.
Right.
The way I originally read the concept was I took it to mean municipal, but that's not really. I went back and in reading it, that's not what it
You
says.
you could have private water, or you could have a well. And in the way private water is gone, and the town board's going to end up taking over an abandoned water district. That's just how it's gone in the past.
Right. So if whether the village decides to grant water access to something that doesn't have a water district on it currently is purely in the hands of the village. And at the time that someone comes forward with a master development plan, they're going to have to explore that. They're going to have to find the opportunity for water, just like every other project that we do. If they don't have it, if they don't have water, they're
And the
they have
zones
no,
out,
they
right?
have no, then they have no then they really have no request before the town board. It'll be the same thing with the sewer district. I mean, we all certainly know what the issues are around, the sewer district one. But if sewer district one says to a developer, nope, we can't support this, then again, they really have no plan to go further with the town board. Those are kind of non-starters.
Which
But
leads to
you're right.
well. I didn't see anything in that environmental impact statement on the wells that are in there. They just said, well, water's the only other option here.
It's one of the only other options. There was a little discussion of that in the depth of that on, and I certainly have to admit I didn't get through everything in the appendices myself because it's just the amount of fine detail there. But
The impact stuff, Jeff.
um, I think it's a very valid point that water and sewer being required, no matter what the source, is a concern on this concept. But the reality is, all that land that is eligible for CCR, wherever it is in the town, is zoned for something. And someone can come in and propose to the planning board to develop that. And in the same way, they're going to have to demonstrate that they've got the resources when it comes to water or sewer. In the CCR, it's going to require sewer, where some of the projects that come before us are on septic. Because they're a little more forgiving in that way. But yeah, I absolutely get that concern. What are the other things that you're concerned about, in relation to resources and other things?
Well, let's see. Resources. I mean, I still think 170 units at the test case is a much lesser density than the 400 and some odd that were proposed in the test case. Traffic was an issue. Police was an issue. Like I said, it's the village police that are going to come and fill out the accident report, and state police maybe if there's a car around.
Excuse me, Jason, could you explain that? If why would the village be involved with
Because the intersection where I can visualize the additional traffic going is in the village. The village police would be the ones who respond to an accident there.
See,
so
you're thinking of
hold on.
because it borders right on the village. The increased traffic through the surrounding village areas. That's where the accidents might happen, or the other incidences might happen that would put a strain on the village police. That's an interesting point.
Well, yeah, so I guess what I just want to pick that apart a little just to clarify my understanding of what your concern is. So even though an accident may occur in the town because it's adjacent to a critical intersection, the police department is going to respond to that intersection.
No, the physical location of the intersection is within a different municipality that has its own police force.
Why would the town planning board be reviewing a plan within the village boundaries? And then the other question
That's not
is,
what Jason's suggesting. So, as part of the CCR concept, at least half the project has to be located within a half a mile of the village borders, whether it's Village of Monroe, Village of Harriman. So, the thought part of the concept here with the CCR is to develop those parts of the town that are close in by the villages where density is already heavier and more services are available and that kind of thing, to develop that part of the town with higher density housing and leave the outer lying areas of the town less developed. So, just from a logical standpoint, if you're in one of these on the outskirts of the village areas, most of your travel for services, for food, for banking, for other shopping, for pharmaceuticals, whatever it is going to be in the direction of the village. So because these properties are just outside the village, what Jason's thought is you're going to have increased traffic between these properties and these village centers where commerce is located, and it's going to increase the possibility of accidents in that part of the village. It's not just increased traffic in the town, but it will increase traffic in towards the village center. It's a valid
so
point.
so a couple of just Chase, a couple of things that I'm thinking about. So during the public hearing that town has, the village would, or as an interested agency, they would have an opportunity to talk about that impact that they would have to their resources. So, but the town board could snub the village's concern over that and say, that's your problem. This development's in the town, and that spillover. Although we hear what you're saying, you should, consider that in your resources.
I understand it.
And then the other thing with regard to central sewer and water, if it's within the village, the village should have a build out plan based on their zoning for what the water resources are available to meet build out, but they may not necessarily or are not required to extend their services outside the village boundary because of a town project. And the same thing with the county sewer. The county also within their district, they have a build out number 2, so that if the development exceeds their planning projections, they would have a basis for denying that or project, or the developer would have to provide their own resources to meet those demands.
Well, right, and for sewer there really isn't another resource because they're not going to approve a CCR designation to be landed where septic would be required. That's
They could have multiple septic fields that may not be conventional septic systems, but large scale septic fields to meet.
the way I'm reading the law as proposed. It actually requires sewer. So now Sean could correct me if I'm wrong, but if it says sewer, septic would not be an acceptable solution in that case.
Well, I think they could propose their own sewer treatment on site. They don't necessarily have to tie into the Orange County Sewer District number 1.
But even if they were doing sewage treatment on site, wouldn't it eventually all flow through the district?
No, that's the danger in the having it not say municipal sewer, but rather having it as a common or community approach. So that might be another clarification that the board may want to bring up is the intent to have municipal services rather than community or the like.
I think that would certainly be some valid feedback as a concern from the board. I am more concerned if it's not municipal myself.
I've always disliked the reference to the word central. because central doesn't tell you what it means. It says, if it says municipal or government or something to that extent, it's clear. When it says central, I think Anthony's lived with that for a lot of years. It can mean a lot of things.
Yeah, and to pick up on Jason's point, those types of public um, services like sewer and water, starts out at private and then they fail, and then the public is ended up picking up the baggage.
Right. I think we're in way better shape if a municipality has decided to take that on right from the start, and we know going in that this development will have service. And again, that's a municipal decision then, and the public will have input on that, but the municipality will ultimately make its decision.
So I have a couple of questions on what you guys are discussing. Number one, as far as water and creating water districts that become either dedicated or taken over by the municipality, whatever the correct term is. Doesn't that happen all the time anyway? And as far as central sewer, without looking back at past experience from what could be decades ago, would not the developer have to go through a significant amount of tests, confirmations, and hurdles and approvals to get, let's say, a package plant uh, developed and operational?
You can get a central system approved, not maintain it properly, not have the resources to keep it in the proper shape. When you run out of money and go bankrupt, the town has to pick up the pieces, and then the entire municipality or a district created in the municipality can't afford to bring it into proper shape, and it creates a real nightmare. The town has dealt with that now already several times.
That's sort of what's happening with Councilwoman Bingham's water district.
Yeah,
So
that's a water district. I'm talking about a sewer, a sewer facility.
it can be the same thing with sewer, and that's the danger in the term central versus public.
Well, aren't sewer facilities paid for and maintained by payers?
Yeah, but you can have a corporation own and operate the system, and then that corporation can lose its ability to properly maintain it or be underfunded. And when they
Let's use an example of a developer decides that they're going to pursue this designation, and ultimately they're going to do it's going to be condos and townhouses, let's say. So there's a homeowners association now. For whatever reason, a number of units go vacant, and they lose the revenue from that. Then you have another, subsection of townhouses where, for one reason or another, they're not paying common charges. So now all of a sudden, your homeowners association board doesn't have the money, and even if they try and do a special assessment, aren't able to raise enough if a major something comes up with their private sewer, with their private water, that they can't manage to do that. It's not like an individual homeowner in their well, and the well goes bad, and well, it's one more thing in maintaining a home. When you're dependent on everybody chipping in a situation like that, and having a friend who was a president of a homeowners association for a dozen years, stories like this were very common in that one situation. But I know it happens frequently. I used to live in condos myself, so I can understand where that concern is. And I must admit, I would prefer that right from the start we were dealing with a municipal buy-in to take care of sewer and water if the CCR were to be approved.
Well, I'm gonna continue to play the devil's advocate here.
Please do. That's what we're here for tonight.
Because wastewater is a fact of life, and it's a tremendous fact of life here in Orange County. Um, you know, if any of these lands are within either the Moodna district or the sewer district number one, I'm not sure. Um, and you know, those units are entitled to request approval for sewer hookups. Um, if something like this doesn't happen, I think we need to consider the trade-offs. You know, you're talking about trading off um, complete density of 1 acre per housing unit, and it will happen. It may not happen this year or next year, but I can guarantee it's going to happen within 20 years. Um, so we're gonna throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Are we gonna say no? You know, we don't think this is a good idea because of possible hypotheticals, and create a self-fulfilling prophecy that hey, it's going to be developed out 100%. It's going to be developed out with the largest footprint of home possible, with the least amount of attention paid to workforce housing rentals and senior housing, and making walkable communities with retail and service establishments that are, you know, you can walk to. Um, and when that happens, you, I'm sure you're going to see a lot more stresses on the environment in the next generation, because you're not limiting the footprints and the amount of population explosion that can happen in areas like this. And then you're really going to stress water resources and sewer and septic resources down the road. I think that, you know, there's a little bit of a throttle governor in this plan. You know, when you take a look at the footprints of the apartments, you know, 850 and 650 square feet, and the limitations on the bedrooms per household, that makes the future much more manageable.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things, just to speak to what you're saying, is when you're talking about impact on the land. So one of the things that we've seen as a planning board, looking back over some of the decisions that we've made over the 2 years, say that we've been working under the new comprehensive plan, is when it comes to developers having to submit to us a conventional plan and a cluster plan, generally speaking, as a board, we tend to like the clustering because it does preserve land as unbuilt. That we're willing to trade off higher density on part of the land for preserving some of it. Well, this concept does that to an even greater degree. You know, the reality is that and you know, again, I want to try and stay away from the test site a little bit later, but the Rye Hill corridor was looking to be built out completely. If the CCR zone was landed there or wherever else it was landed in the town, it's going to take some of the land and preserve that. There will be no impermeable surfaces on 65% of the land. And of the 35% that's remaining, only so much of that land is allowed to be covered. So I think it actually works out when you consider permeable surfaces. If I did the math right, it winds up roughly being 21% of the entire, you know, property that becomes covered. That's impervious surfaces. It's almost 80%. I mean, you know, just from a water standpoint alone. And then to think about that land, that 65% being set aside for wildlife to use, you know, whether it's plant life or fauna. Um, I tend to agree with John. I think that there's a lot of opportunities here. It's so how do we perfect how do we address and perfect our concerns with what might happen if CCR went into effect? Um, with the concept. I mean, I guess and listen, everyone entitled to their opinion. Jason has one, John has one, I have one. Anthony, Lisa, Pat, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Generally speaking, do you think just pro or con a little bit about, is this a good concept for the town to consider? Is this something that you feel they should veer away from?
I'm sorry, I just have one more thing to say, and then I'll be quiet.
Yeah,
Uh,
please.
you know, the other thing we have to consider based on, the alternate scenario, which I think is 179 units on 1 acre. What's going to happen 10 years from the moment those homes have their certificates of occupancy is you're going to have an influx of applications for accessory apartments. So you're really looking at the potential for 360 units over, those X amount of acres that are basically those acres are the victim of sprawl at that point. And then what's going to happen to your resources? What's going to happen to wastewater and drinkable water at that point? So, and I'll mute myself now.
I have a question. I don't understand at all what John's talking about. The future in 20 years, and I mean, I think 65% is supposed to be, let's say, kept in a natural state, but at the cost of high density, which is not what the homes in this area are like to begin with. I've seen it in Warwick where they sold all the farmland. It was all land that people grew food on, and animals, I'm sure, lived in it. And now they have a lot of high density, and it kind of, if you lived there prior to that, you knew what the town was like. So, I mean, I don't understand what John's talking about. One of the other things about the walkability, there are other towns that have sidewalks, like Chester is near, next to us, and Warwick is next to us. They do have sidewalks in their village, and it doesn't seem like Monroe has ever had that as a priority. Otherwise, we would have them. I mean, in Central Valley, they widened Route 32 and put sidewalks in, probably for the walkability. But so some of the things that you're talking about don't seem to make sense to me. And I don't see how they can be hooking up to village water if they're not in the village, and why the village planning board wouldn't have anything to say about it. So I'm listening. I wrote down a whole bunch of stuff, and it's very, very confusing to me. And I'm not pointing to one person to say, answer this or answer that, but there are some inconsistencies with what we're talking about. And I mean, as far as what Sean was saying, I truly don't understand what he means when he did say 179 houses or units on an acre. I don't know where we're getting that from.
So where those numbers are coming from are from the test site, because that was where they did the in-depth study for the environmental review. And so there were various projects along the Rye Hill corridor that were in various states of approval or planning. And so as part of the test comparison, they compared what they felt would be a good example of a master development plan versus what was already in the works. If everything that was in the works had gotten a final approval and through the planning board, what the development would have been like there. So a little bit about what John saw. So if all of those were conventional layouts, they all, with the exception of one, they all started before the new comprehensive plan and the new requirement for cluster housing to be at least considered. So if they were built out conventionally, and then based on what the current town law is. After 10 years, they would be eligible to build accessory apartments. So John's suggesting that there's a real possibility of quite a bit more strain over the course of years, even if they didn't use the CCR on this particular piece of property, just with traditional housing, than what was fully considered in the DGEIS. And frankly, John, I think that's a really interesting point to bring up as far as our feedback into this. Are they doing, they're doing a short-term comparison, but maybe they haven't looked at the impact in the long range as much as they need to. I think that's a very interesting point. Lisa, I have a question about your example from Warwick. So where you feel where farms were sold and high density housing or of one type or another was added, were there any provisions in Warwick to set aside land for conservation? I'm curious if their concept was somewhat similar to what's being proposed here. And I don't know the answer. You have a familiarity that I don't. Lisa, you with us?
I'm sorry, I had to unmute. Sorry
It's
about
okay.
that. So, no, I would not know what the planning was, because I'm on the planning board. You know, you're kind of tuned into more of this stuff now. Plus, I'm an adult. I mean, when that happened, I was a kid, so I wouldn't know. They've actually built their own little village within some of the land that they had, and they put their own library and a couple of other things. And you know, I'm just saying that as an example. It is a neighboring area, and I wasn't a homeowner at the time, but I am now. I didn't like what I saw happen to the town that I grew up in, and I understand things change and stuff like that. But I would take the acre lots, the single family homes, as opposed to the high density, just to squeeze them in there. It seems like it's almost, let's get as many houses in the least amount of land, and that's not what most of the land in this area, in the little towns and villages that maybe we come from or that we can drive through. It's usually not this high density. So, and the sidewalks, I actually like
frankly
sidewalks.
think that's a very important point, Lisa.
The complaint I've always had is there's no sidewalks. But then now all of a sudden, let's have sidewalks, let's have high density. Where's it coming from? And then, like I'm saying, John mentioned something about the future in 20 years. I don't see that putting 40 homes on 40 acres is going to equate to, you know, even if somebody does after the 10-year period put in the accessory apartment, that's an apartment. That's not putting in, you know, if I look at the chart, it's not putting in double the amount. Because that's what, that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about, whether, I'm not sure if this is the time to discuss it or not, but, you know, we had 145 lots, and then it was going to be 491 units. So, you know, that's 3 times the amount of homes if you compare units to lots, because there's going to be 1 home on a lot, and there's going to be, you know, units are going to be built, let's say on an acre. I don't know how many units are going to be built on an acre, where we know that 40 acres was going to be 40 homes. So it is high density. It's I believe, you know, the homes are going to have a height requirement of 40 feet. I had questions also about when we put this, it's listed on page 1-13, it says a maximum 40-foot building height. And then there was requirements as far as a single family detached residence would be 2,700 square feet. So then that question does arise as far as, can they put the accessory apartment? It sounds like they can't. Is there any additions? Can someone put an addition if they decide they want to bump out a wall and, you know, make a family room where they didn't have one before? Like some of the things that people think that they do when they buy a home, and, you know, as your family changes, sometimes you need maybe a bigger home. So I guess in this situation, they'd have to move to an area of Monroe that sells bigger homes. Like they wouldn't be able to put an addition. That's what this seems to read.
So
So,
my understanding is that depending on the type of home, if there was a built-out CCR zoning district, that there's size limitations that are effectively like bulk table requirements. So if the home is already built to the maximum size that that type of home could be built for,
Right.
then no, my thought would be that Ben would look at that and say, no, you've already built up to the maximum that a home of this type can be. It'd be very unusual. So, but I think you and John have both touched on an interesting point, and it's something that I had taken under consideration as well, which is the types of homes that are typically in our town now. And I guess the question that we have to consider whether we want to input on is the CCR would allow for a greater diversity of types of homes in our town than what is typically available now. There's very limited amount of property in the town currently that isn't single family detached homes. And the question is, do we think that there should be more diversity? You know, what this would allow is things that aren't normally standard uses in a zone. So it might include in a zone that typically is going to be, again, single family residences of such and such a size on such and such a piece of property. It might allow townhouses, condos, apartments. It might allow, attached homes or detached homes. It might allow for multifamily housing. It might allow for senior housing or workforce type housing. And I guess the question becomes, and you can kind of see both sides of the argument, is if the CCR serves to promote that in a town that doesn't have that, is that a good thing or is it not a good thing? What's your feelings?
What about the people that already live in the zone and then their zones change? Like, are they going to be happy with the townhome development next to their properties that when they bought it was, zoned residential and they thought, or like I live in the village, I know the lots are closer together. People who live in the town, their lots are usually spread out a little bit. We don't know how the public is going to feel about changing the zoning or putting some type of overlay which might grab their house or their neighbor's home or something like that. We don't know how they're going to feel about that.
We certainly don't, and it's a good thing that at many times during the process they'll have the ability to speak to that subject. But I think the larger question for us is would the town of Monroe be served by having more diversified housing than what we have now, or would that detract from the town?
I'd like to answer that. To me, the answer is yes. We are lacking in senior living.
Yeah.
We're lacking
I
in
agree with you.
workforce living. I'm in a position personally here where, my daughter's out of high school and, if I wanted to, or if I had to leave my home to get into a better situation tax wise, I wouldn't be able to stay in Monroe. And I did want to just clarify my comments about walkability, because Lisa brought up a very good point, and I wasn't clear. What I mean by walkability is not just sidewalks. Like, hey, I want to go out and take a walk, and there's a sidewalk there. Part of, and it always strikes me as so ironic that, hey, this development of 60 homes is supposed to have X amount of homes dedicated to senior living. And it's all the way on the south side of the town of Monroe. Where are these people going to go on these sidewalks?
Yeah.
If they want to go shopping, they've got to get on a dial-a-bus or they have to drive. And I think it's very well thought out in this CCR plan that they set aside that 5% footprint for, retail, restaurant, and services, because wouldn't it be great if you could age into a community that had a local market where you didn't have to go get on the dial-a-bus to shop right every day. So that was my reasoning behind my walkability comment.
Yeah, I agree with the senior housing. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of that. The walkability, as far as the sidewalks, you do see, like I said, Chester has sidewalks through their village. So I'm not opposed to sidewalks. We've just never had sidewalks here before. And it has been something that, like I said, if you go to a different area, I do notice that kind of a thing, because it is something I would be interested in. But as far as the high density is concerned, I don't know. And then again, with the village water, if they're building on the outskirts of the village, if it's not in the village, I don't know how they would hook up to it or even get approvals without going through the village planning board for that kind of stuff.
You're right.
And then we're
It would have to go before the village to get into municipal systems.
So this is Ashley, and just to touch on that, what I think it was mentioned in there somewhere too, that they would need a user agreement with the village in order to do that. So that would definitely have to be by the village.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What does this do to the value of the lots that are there now? Does it make that land more valuable because they're going to put more homes that you can sell, let's say, on the acre that they would have sold one home? Now there's going to be so many townhomes. Does that property, I don't know at what state it's at, if the developer owns it or they're going to purchase it, but what does it do to the value of the property if they change the zoning?
You have to, think about it holistically, right? Because the developer is going to have to purchase 100% of the property. Now, 65% of that's going to go fallow, right? It's not going to be developed on at all. So that portion of the property is going to be less valuable to the developer than it would have alternately been. But the 35% is going to, if they plan it out well, either equal what it would be to build on 100%, but perhaps do it at less cost, or perhaps, again, if it's intelligently designed, the master development plan will make that 35% what is built more valuable than what it would have been if they had developed the whole 100%. But still,
Well,
we get,
I agree with you.
preservation and
It
things
does
like that.
sounds like it's going to make the property more valuable. And then if we're talking about the 65% that's not going to be built on, who's responsible for that? Because once a developer builds, and then if you have townhomes, does that become part of the HOA? Are they going to care for it? Who's supposed to take care of any of this 65% property? Because if you have 40 lots and you build 40 homes, we know that there's going to be 40 homeowners who are going to take care of all that property. So I wrote down so many questions. I don't know if it sounds like I'm not necessarily for it, but unless I get answers to what's going on in my head, I'm not on board just yet. To me, it doesn't sound like it's a good idea, but maybe if we talk it through,
we don't get the ability to approve on this. The opportunity to tonight, honestly, explore all the questions we have. So ask all the questions you have, because that's ultimately going to go into what we then feed back to the town board, who is going to make an approval decision on whether to go forward with this amendment or not. So I love all the questions. I love all the discussion, and I think it's good that we're exploring our thoughts on this.
Hey Jeff, wouldn't that 65% be treated the same way that conservation easements are being treated now when we approve a cluster development?
Right. Yeah, it would be treated exactly that same way.
So it'd be passive, right?
What's interesting about this is, again, conceptually, because we're talking about large acreage developments, 80 acres or more. And honestly, in most of these cases, we're going to be talking about bigger properties. In the test case, it talks about approximately 250 square acres. When you're talking about big tracts of land that are being set aside like that, that's when you get groups like the land trusts who wants to step in and take over responsibility for that, because it adds to their whole mission in Orange County. The land trust is to preserve significant tracts of land, valuable pieces of property, and valuable from an ecological standpoint, and a natural standpoint, rather than valuable from a developer standpoint. So I think that for many of the projects that would ultimately be proposed, if this amendment goes into effect, someone like the land trust is going to want to step in and take responsibility for that. But yes, there's always the opportunity for the town. It could become dedicated parkland to the town, which has also happened in the past. Faber Farm is a terrific example of that. And that's set aside land. There's others along Orange Turnpike that are properties that the town is responsible for. Frankly, across from me by the Orange and Rockland Lakes, that's also was land set aside, and the town took responsibility for that, and it's a town park. So one way or the other, someone becomes responsible for that. So it is. We're familiar. No one is probably more familiar with the concept of setting aside a piece of land for conservation than this planning board.
Mhm. You don't want that they take 65% of this large chunk of land, and then whoever owns it can turn around in 10 or 15 years and decide to sell it again. And the whole purpose of doing this was so that only 35% was buildable, and you mentioned when you get down to it, it's about 21%. So you don't want this 65% of this land, which is a large chunk of property, eventually turning around to be sold again and developed again. If we were, we're going under the guise that if we go forward with this, and I don't even know, that doesn't seem like it's our decision, but if this does happen, and it makes it sound, okay, we're going to have high density at the cost of saving 65% of these larger groups of properties that would have maybe been developments. You don't want to have it end up falling in someone's hands that can turn around and sell it again. I mean, I don't know who's going to end up with this 65% that's not supposed to be built on. So that's another, it's almost like one question and then we answer that and you get another question. So and plus it's a huge document to read. And again, with the appendixes, I didn't get the chance to look at them. So I am going to. I don't know if this is our only opportunity to discuss this.
At this point, the public hearing was left open when the town board met on the 25th. Obviously, they're very sensitive to the fact that we're working through governmental meetings in very unusual circumstances.
Yeah.
So they want to have as much opportunity for public and for involved agencies to have a chance to provide feedback. So we can continue after tonight's meeting to compile thoughts and food for thought to ultimately put into whatever our feedback to the town board is. We should have a little bit longer opportunity. I believe they extended the written period already from the 6th to the 16th, as memory serves, from the meeting on the 25th. I caught most of the meeting, but I was in and out a little bit for one reason or another. Anthony, Jason, how do you feel about diversity of housing? Thoughts on that?
I was going to let Jason go first. Is he still there? I didn't see him. Is he still on?
I'm muted.
I'm not sure.
I'm muted. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're here.
All right, I'm back. So I can see
Jason, you have the
both
floor. What's your thoughts on diversity of housing?
I can see both sides, and I'm going to sound like the biggest meanie head here. when I say that I don't think Monroe is very, it's not senior friendly. It's not workforce friendly. And I think there's a certain expectation that when you move to Monroe, and I'm sure every single one of you board members ask yourself this question when you move to Monroe is, why are we moving to Monroe? And I'm sure one of the first answers you will say is the school district. And so once, everyone's out and you've made your mess and, you're done with everything, it does start to get expensive and you start to not get a service or feel the services of that. And so I can understand why, we all want to keep grandma and grandpa close. I wanted to keep my grandparents close in New York. But ultimately they moved to Florida for a tax haven. Right? You don't move to Monroe for a tax haven. You move there for the school and the other community and local services that are available to you. Some of which, or most of which, are not the most senior engaging. And so I see the point to keeping it. I do, but I don't see how it's a successful plan forward.
Well, and I absolutely agree with what you just said. Can I flip that concept on you that this might just not, provide senior housing, which again, I'm all for in this community because I really feel we are underserved, but for keeping, so you're comparatively speaking to me, a relatively recent graduate of Monroe Woodbury, right?
Right. That was almost 10
It was
years.
a long time ago for me. I managed, to stay local, but that was decades ago. I think that in today's world, it's very hard for the youth who are graduating MW and then going off to college and then coming back to Monroe and want to stay in Monroe to do that. That there's not enough appropriate housing in a town that is virtually strictly, as Lisa said, single family detached homes, and she's right about that.
And I'll counsel you on that one.
To serve the people that grew up here, and I'll tell you, until I started working locally, because I worked in Jersey, way down for a long time, having come home 7 years ago and working in the county and working now in the town for the last 5 years, I had no idea how many of the kids that I graduated with 30 years ago still live around here. But because all of us, not for nothing, said the first thing we do when we graduate college is we're getting out of here. But the reality is, for all the people that left, a ton of people came back, or a ton of people never left. But is that as feasible for my kids as it was for me? And I don't feel that it is, frankly.
You're absolutely right
might help with that.
Because so I remember when the Harriman Transit Development was being proposed, I went to those meetings.
Yeah.
And I spoke to the developer, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm going to charge $2,000 for a studio." And it's like, why would I pay $2,000 for a studio in Monroe that has a 2C train right to Manhattan, where my job is? It's an hour each way, plus like I got to sit on a train for an hour, especially given today's climate. Sitting on a train is not exactly the first thing I want to do. But you're going to charge me $2,000 for that when I can go to Hoboken and pay $2,000 for a studio. That's going to be a 25-minute PATH train ride away. And maybe it is, maybe it is part of the wage of not keeping up. And that's a larger societal problem that frankly we're not going to solve. As much as I would like to think we can.
No, I don't. I agree with you.
It's not. Given the choice of paying $2,000 in Monroe and spending, 2 hours each way commuting like I almost do now, I would spend $2,000 in Hoboken, and I'd save to do other things, online classes, to just better myself that I would not get in Monroe. That makes sense?
But we will continue to see growth in this county. It's the county, as part of their comprehensive plan, has projected it out. And with that growth is going to come more jobs to this area. I mean, we know about all the development that's being proposed in our county. The IDA is going to swell job of bringing a lot of big projects to the county, and that's going to continue to happen. There will be over time more good paying jobs in Orange County. There'll be more people here for those jobs, but it'd be nice if some of the residents of Monroe can get out of college, get some of those jobs, and stay local so that they're not
Oh, I
taking a
know.
2-hour train ride from northern Ulster, where it might be affordable for them to live, to be able to work in Monroe or to work in the Orange County area. So I mean, I absolutely, I think you're 100% right.
As it is right now, those are the facts of life for someone who's my age.
Absolutely. Anthony, what's your thoughts?
So I'm mixed because there's no doubt that there's a lot of real estate pressure in this area. I mean, they're not expanding the Thruway and the Exchange and Woodbury Commons and building Legoland because there's not a lot of real estate pressure. And I do like the idea of having flexibility and options and diversity because I think that best serves the public. I also like the idea of having open tract land. I think that's essential for a good ecosystem. Having land bridges for critters, animals, amphibians to get through and preserving. But I do think that when you create these types of plans, just like we've seen with cluster development, you do facilitate maximum build out. So a developer will come in and say, listen, I can put 20 lots on here. On paper, it looks good. I'll flatten the whole place, put 20 lots. And if you push comes to shove, you say, okay, build your 20 lots, and he's got to invest a disproportionate amount of money to level. And he said, you know what, maybe 20 lots is a little excessive. Let's go with 17. But if you allow them to cluster a development, or you allow them to concentrate into a small portion of land, then they don't have to build out that infrastructure like they would. And so, they're going to want to build out at every opportunity if they're in business to make money. So I do think that, is a little bit of a fatal flaw. And I also appreciate what Jason said about services and neighboring strains. So, for the town, they may be able to benefit from this. But maybe it will be the village, either maybe not necessarily the water department, but it may be village neighbors who have to deal with concentrated areas and that will impact traffic and impact commerce through their area. Where, as Lisa said, I had a single family house next door, and now I have an apartment building, and that's not what I signed up for. So I have mixed feelings.
Well, and it certainly sounds like as a group, we see both sides of the concept and the pros and cons of that. And I think that it would be appropriate if our feedback to the town board reflected both sides of that. This is what we like about it. This is where our concerns are, so that they're considering the full picture that we're just considering. A couple of detail things, if I may, for a minute. In relation to some of the things that I saw. So one of the things that I'd like for us to recommend is when they get to the FGIS, that they update the current boundaries of the town of Monroe, the various maps that delineate that. There are multiple instances of the maps in the DGEIS that show the town boundaries prior to the 163 or 58 acre annexation into the town of Palm Tree. So because it's showing old boundaries, I don't know that it's quite properly reflecting on the maps when you're looking at them, all of the impacts, if you will. Like one of the things that I looked at in relation to that was most of the land prior to these annexations and prior to the updated comprehensive plan and zoning map in 2017 that were designated as URM housing, URM zones in the town were now annexed into the town of Palm Tree. Certainly the 163 acres were all designated as that. And then another portion of the land that was part of the 58 was designated as URM. Those are all now in another municipality. What's left in the town are these things: Lamplight Village, the land that's going to be developed on the Bald Hill project. And then there's several parcels of land in the Gilbert Street area near where Smith's Farm is being developed. Not part of Smith Farms, but near where Smith Farms is being developed that are zone URM. So we really lost quite a bit of that kind of designated zone in the town. And, you know, maybe the CCR serves, and again, I'm not 100% clear on whether it does, but, you know, every municipality is required to have a certain amount of land set aside for that type of zoning. Basically, as far as the state is concerned, that's fair. Everybody should have their share of higher density housing that lends towards multifamily and that kind of thing. If most of the land, I believe most of the land, if 50% of the land, let's say, that was formerly designated as URM in the town now isn't in our town, do we have a responsibility to give an option to provide that to developers and ultimately to the residents who are going to live and want to live in those kinds of areas in the town? So I'm sort of wondering whether the CCR would help bring that back into balance within the new town boundaries. The other thing that I'm kind of curious about, and the test case doesn't speak to it because, so the CCR, I want to understand if the CCR designation affects the requirements of the water supply protection overlay or the ridge line protection overlay. In other words, if a property currently containing one of these overlays was granted CCR zoning, would the overlay requirements still be in effect, or would they be negated in this situation? So if CCR designation was given to somewhere and part of that property was under ridgeline protection overlay, would it wipe out those protections? Or would those protections still be in effect on top of all the other requirements that CCR requires as part of the development? And frankly, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's one that we should ask. Thoughts on any of these things, the map, the URM, or the protection overlays? Do you think we should be asking those questions?
Well, I think what you bring up as far as the overlays makes sense, that they should be enforced if they were in the, any of those overlays. I would hope that the CCR does take into consideration those things. So I agree with what you're talking about, and we should maybe ask that question.
I would think that they'd still be in place. What's interesting is in the test case, there's both of those come into play, but the only areas of the property that they come into play on are parts of the land that would be part of the conservation easement. So they're not going to be developed on anyway. So everything that the water supply protection does, the conservation easement supports, everything ridgeline protection, requires conservation easements, just supports, it magnifies those things. And I do like that the CCR requires that what is conserved is the most valuable land to be conserved. Generally speaking, it's the land furthest away from the village borders, but the land that's of most conservation value is what's required under CCR to be under conservation easement. So again, I would think that those things would just become additive. Ashley, do you know about that at all? Whether the CCR might wipe out the protections by ridgeline or water supply?
I do not. And I just was looking at that, and I did see in the test case how they both had those. And the way, to me, it would seem that since they weren't proposing anything in there, that means that they would, they should still apply. But that's definitely something you could, include in your comments, which, as far as your comments in general, I've been, taking things down as everyone's spoken, but you're you don't really have a consensus on a lot of things. So we could talk about, how to best convey everything to the town board. But I think you or Lisa had maybe mentioned another meeting. And I think if we have, Noreen, the April meetings, maybe we could even, talk about it at the end of one of those meetings or something, just to make sure I know what you want to convey and everyone, feels comfortable with what the board's going to say.
So right now for the April meetings, we technically don't have any projects for April 9th. The 3 projects that did come in were Joel Schultzel. I don't know how to say his last name. I apologize. He's the medical building, and it was with the ramp and taking out of the windows. So he's back. And then Joel Mann with 81 Raywood and Monroe Commons, but he's requested to be on April 21st because April 9th is the first night of Passover. So Yoel's representative would not be available either on April 9th. So we tentatively do not have a project. I know Walmart reached out to Tony the other day because they said that they were at a standstill, but the standstill is on their part. I haven't heard anything more back on that, whether they're looking to be put on a meeting right away or not. So we could, if you wanted, schedule a meeting to discuss this again for April 9th and just make that our workshop meeting.
I think that's a great idea. I think it would give people some more time to, take what we've discussed tonight. And I do want to discuss a little bit more before we break up tonight, if you'll bear with me. But that would give us an opportunity then to consolidate our thoughts, and we can come up with what we really want to ultimately convey to the town board, and still have plenty of time, considering we have at least till the 16th. That would give us a week. Would that be good, Ashley? Okay, so
Wait, I think I see a few people from the public. Do we want to let them speak or not tonight?
well, this is not that kind of. They're welcome to observe our conversation, but there is no public hearing component this evening for this. What I would like to, we've touched on it here and there. It's kind of been hard not to, but I want to talk about particularly concerns about the test site and what's is being proposed there, especially since, as I stated in the beginning of our meeting, if this amendment is adopted, if they approve the FGEIS, and if the town board does go forward with the zoning amendment, if someone were to purchase those properties and propose anything up to and including what has already been studied, that is all the environmental review is done as part of the process already. So any feedback we have on that, the couple of things that I had, and then I'll try and get out of the way, is if you've had a chance to look at it, there's an eastern parcel and a western parcel. The eastern parcel, all the traffic flows out through one exit onto Orange Turnpike, just beyond Reynolds Road, past what is the town hall now. The western parcel is proposed with 3 exits onto the Rye Hill corridor, Rye Hill Road, between, kind of running along the Maple Knolls development. So beyond Reynolds Road and before you get to Alex Smith to turn into the northern part of the Maple Knolls development, or whatever that's called. And certainly, well before you get to High Ridge Road, let's say. So one of the things that I'd like to suggest is that they consider reworking that. Instead of 3 exits, there's 2 exits. I think that there's the portion of the western proposal, what you run into starting from Reynolds Road area is first a senior housing building, then a couple of rows of apartment buildings with parking in and amongst all those. Then you have a little bit of a break, and then in the southernmost portion of that western portion, you get townhouses. There's 1 exit from the townhouses. There's 2 exits from what is the apartments and senior housing. And I feel like those 2 exits in the apartment senior housing could be consolidated into the northernmost exit by just turning that exit road, running it along parallel to Rye Hill, and connecting right in with the other connector road that will lead into that exit. There's a lot of roads that already lead onto Rye Hill Road. Jason, brought up the subject of traffic on that corridor already. And there's a lot of private driveways that come out onto Rye Hill Road. I think the fewer additional exit entrances from that western portion, the better. Sight lines can be weird. Traffic often exceeds the posted speed limit in that area. That's just a reality. When you're flowing downhill on Rye Hill is from the top is a very long downhill. And I've driven many times myself because I grew up on Monroe. And to get to my street, you went downhill for a long way. And in younger days, I too may not have always obeyed the speed limit because you just keep going down, 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 and you get velocitation there. So I'm concerned about the number of exits and entrances from there. And if they can turn it to two, we're better off. The other thing that I kind of wanted to talk about is I don't really, I guess they talked to that the Village of Monroe could supply water to both the eastern and western parcels, but it doesn't really explore the willingness. And I think that speaks to what Jason was talking about before, especially in relation to water. And I think it would be valuable to, if that's apropos as part of the EIS process, to have a conversation with the Village of Monroe to conceptually talk about, is there willingness to expand water districts further into the town in that test site area? And alternately, is there another municipal source of water for that proposal? There's other municipalities out there. You lay enough water pipe, you can get water into an area. You know, if you're willing to pay for it, and there's a value in doing it for a municipality, then they may choose to do so. So the question is there conceivably any other water source from a surrounding municipality that could come into those sites? So those are my two big things on the test plan. Generally speaking, I have to be honest. I like what was proposed there. I happen to like the diversity of housing. I like the design. I like that the wetlands are well protected beyond, in most cases, the 100-foot boundary that the town requires. I like that there's walking paths from the two different sections, you know, and nature trails and the ability for, you know, it gets back to what John was talking about with walkability. It's not just sidewalks and getting into the village, but it's getting around in our own community and doing it in a way that promotes health and exercise and environmentalism and all the things that we've said time and time again in the town of Monroe are important to us. So that's sort of my thoughts. What's everybody else thinking about the test site?
Well, this is Pat.
Thank you.
I'm very familiar with the test site area, having grown up on it. And, you know, I remember as a kid during high school working for Alex Smith, we'd cut hay on the field and collect the bales, put it in his barn and so on and so forth. But so I'm very interested in this property is contiguous to mine. As a matter of fact, we used to own the property. So I'm very familiar with it. I was always been very concerned about what could have happened with the conventional development, whether it goes back to Pat Coviello or other developers that we sold the property to. And this plan, I think, the site plan, is the best thing that I've seen since you know, since we sold the property originally back in 1985. So I'm all for it. I especially like the senior part of it because it's lower density. I think obviously I'd like to see less traffic on Rye Hill Road than more traffic. I think a lot of the points that you brought up, Jeff, are, you know, right on. You live right down here on Mine Road, so you know the situation very well. You know, I've always been concerned. I have children. When the bus comes, you know, in the winter time, there's no sidewalks on Rye Hill Road. And there's no sidewalks on Rye Hill Road, and when you have snow on both sides, there's not enough room even to walk up the road. So it's a very dangerous situation. And the last thing that we need is more density and more traffic on that road without any safety. So anyway, I mean, it's all relative. You know, we almost, you know, I felt like we just dodged a bullet with the, you know, what was going to happen on this property. Supersized houses. It would have overloaded the infrastructure. You know, it would have been a disaster, and that's why I hired an attorney, came to the board meeting, and you know, we voiced our opposition to it, and I was ready to litigate it against it. So anyway, I'm very familiar with the property. Of all the alternatives that I've seen so far, this seems to be the most attractive to me. And I do think it would actually make the property values go up. I know someone had mentioned what would happen to the property values here. The big thing with the property values here is the uncertainty. You know, the property values here, I believe, have been stale because of what could have happened with the developments that you know, those LLCs were going to do. If you can take 65% of that property or more and make it, you know, give it to the land trust or whatever, and make sure that it's never built on before, and then you have a mixture of working class people and senior people in there. I just think it would be a nice little community, and it would be a good neighborhood to be close to. That's my opinion.
Pat, I really appreciate
what-
the historical perspective
One
on
last
it.
thing. One last thing, Jeff. Wanted to mention, there's a water main that comes right through that property. It comes, you know, from the municipal water. It actually comes through my property as well. So I'm not sure that the village of Monroe would be. It's not like there's going to have to be a lot of money put into getting at that water. So that's all.
Yeah, my understanding from my reading is that the western portion is already part of a water district. So any building on those properties would be eligible to join that water district. It's the eastern portion, the portion out along that runs like with Prestwick Drive along the north and Orange Turnpike along the west. Sorry, no, the east. That isn't part of that. But yeah, the proximity to water isn't bad. What I'm curious about, since you have such a good perspective on the property, is so in looking at the plan, what do you see what are your concerns? What do you see are your limitations? What's the other side of the coin for you?
You know, I think you both voiced some of them. I would like to have less egress onto Rye Hill and more out. Originally, you know, there was going to be, and this goes back to the 80s, there was going to be egress out through Hawksers Road to Orange Turnpike. And I'm not sure what happened to that, but you know, obviously it didn't happen. So I agree with what you had mentioned. I'd like to see less outlet onto Rye Hill Road, less traffic on Rye Hill Road, and more outlet on the other side. I'm also intrigued about the senior housing thing, being a boomer, even more than you. I graduated in '69, so so I would like to see that here. And you know, I think there is a need for it, being a boomer myself. So
Yeah, I didn't realize that at one time the proposed egress from that side was through Hawkshurst. I do think that the egress to the eastern portion is a little close to where the intersection with Reynolds is, and Reynolds is already a little bit difficult. It's honestly as I was reading the traffic study, of all the intersections that would be affected by the build out, at least during peak, that's the one that would degrade the most, not unreasonably so necessarily, but I'm while I prefer that the egress be a little further away from that intersection, I'm sure the folks on Hawkshurst Road, which is, um, not which is kind of a narrow road and all that, would appreciate
Well,
not going through Hawkshurst Road.
no,
So, a win and a loss there.
yeah.
What do the rest of you think about, particulars around the test site? Things you like, things you don't? Major red flags, especially?
No. I'm not a fan of what I feel is or going off of the environmental paperwork that we have before us. I don't believe that the entire burden that is borne on services or expenditures that the village would have to make to supply water, even if there is a water main under the property. I don't believe that's fully taken into account here. I don't like the traffic mitigation measures, which I've discussed a little bit earlier. I'm not a fan of the four-way stop sign. I'm not a fan of leaving no turn or leaving the intersection of Reynolds and Orange Turnpike as it is. I think that there needs to be a turn lane to make a left onto Orange Turnpike or put a light there. That's, I think, the best one, but I know.
That's an interesting mitigation suggestion. Do you have a mitigation suggestion along the Rye Hill corridor? Was there something you saw in looking at the proposal where you said, I would have done it this way, or I would have done this in addition, maybe? I'm not sure if we lost your audio.
Yeah. I would put rumble strips on the road. Because people already fly down that road. Everyone here's done it at least once or twice. I'd put a rumble strip. I'm guilty as charged. I think rumble strips, not speed bumps, but like enough to make you know that you're going downhill and you're going pretty fast and you need to slow down a bit. I think if you slow down the flow of traffic, it becomes a bit more manageable where you don't necessarily need a four-way stop.
That's an interesting suggestion.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Especially along the strip where those three entrances are. It's the one real long straightaway downhill. Everything else, the windy part of the road, helps serve to slow things, at least in some cases. But it's really hard to just know how fast you're going there. It's not something that's been used in the town of Monroe so far, I think, but I've seen it used effectively in other places.
And I would point to there's some stretches on the Palisades Parkway that do that as well.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Sorry to have another question. If I'm looking at the grids that we have here on page 1-2,
Okay.
it mentions the patio home, so I was just curious what that is. And then also, it says owner type, so some of the townhomes are going to be rentals, some are going to be owned, and then apartments, and also the senior apartments are listed as rentals. So I was wondering, how is that going to be determined that the builder would, like, who's going to hold that as a rental? Because, I mean, when I think of building, I just think of, someone's going to purchase it. So I was just wondering where the rental even concept came from, that no one's going to be buying these townhomes.
Well, yeah, some of them will be available for direct ownership. Some will be available for rent. I mean, it could be the developer themselves decides to hold that. They could form a separate company just to do that. An investor could do that. A property management company could come in and do that. They could sell off the rights for the management or the ownership of the building. Technically, the developer could sell the let's say the apartment complexes, those two strips. They could sell that to another company who would then own the apartments and rent them out. So there's a lot of different options in that situation. I had to look
Somebody
at
mentioned
patio
that
home
by
too.
village. So we
What's that?
don't have a lot of apartments in this area. Someone
No, we
mentioned
don't.
Lamplight Village. And so then these are going to be built with the intention of being rentals, being apartments.
In the test case, that's the way it's suggested that one
Okay.
it might look. Yes. Um,
Right.
this isn't they're not approving the test case for build, so to speak. This is a concept of how it might look and how it might involve different things. Frankly, you're right. A developer could come in and propose to put all apartments or all townhouses, or frankly, if they so choose and they looked at the area, they felt, that Orange County was ripe for it, which it probably is, they could put all senior housing. Just because 15% is the minimum requirement doesn't mean you can't exceed that. So there's a lot of flexibility in what a developer would ultimately do. I looked into the definition of patio home. It's not a technical term from what my research showed. It's more of a descriptive thing, probably something that realtors cooked up. It seems to describe it's single family homes that are either generally smaller and are detached. They could be semi-detached, or they could be attached, I guess, which is kind of like a row house sort of a thing. But it's a term to describe these smaller type homes. So we're not talking about the property having townhomes, apartments, senior housing, and mini mansions. I think that's what they were trying to get us to understand when they use the descriptive term patio home. They're talking about smaller single family units. Does that make any sense?
And then, yes. And then you said something made me think of something else. So is senior apartments a suggestion, or would that be a requirement in the CCR loading zone?
They wouldn't have to be apartments. There has to be senior housing. It's required that the CCR have a minimum of 15% of the housing dedicated to senior housing, so 55 and above. But those could be owned or rented. In the test case, it suggested that they'll be rentals, but it's not required that they be rentals. It just requires that they be reserved for residents 55 and above. And as part of the approval process, the developer is going to have to, whatever the legal agreement is, that talks about the process of how they're going to ensure that the residents of that housing are eligible for it.
Okay. So then, when we talked about now, if the CCR voting zone district does go through, that this is all but approved, will they end up coming back to us for any type of reviews? I mean, under 3 of them have conditional. So conditional preliminary subdivision, conditional final subdivision, 2 of them have that. So are we going to see them at all? I mean, the Rye Hill one has no approval.
Well, that's a more complicated question. I would say most likely we're not going to see those come to fruition, one way or the other.
We won't get the chance to ask the developer what their plans are, since this test case seems like we put it together, though, right? I mean, who put the test case together? Does the developer even know?
Put together. So the town planning firm, which happens to be Bonnie's firm, as part of doing the DGEIS, came up with this concept. They put together that plan and said, this is what it could look like on this site, so that you'd have a frame of reference to say, oh, okay, I now know what you're talking. I can look at it and say, oh, okay, this is what it would look like. Maybe, but it's not ready for production, so to speak. It's a concept master development plan. It's saying this is generally what we're looking to do. That would be developed through the approval process by the town board. As I said, we would have input on that, as we have input at this stage. And if the zone was landed, then that site, in this case it would be site plan, would come before us to go through the site plan process.
Okay, so, but is the developer going to know that this is the test case and this is the model that was used? Will they know, or is this just for our purposes for discussion only? When I'm looking at the senior apartments rental and the townhome owned and the numbers that are provided here for us in this grid, are they going to have any concept of what they're going to be building? Do they tell us? Do we tell them? Like, if we're not going to meet with them, where are they going to get this information, or how was it determined? Like, we're looking at this thinking this is what's going to be built. But through the conversation, we're realizing if this is just a model of what could be built, we actually won't know what the developer is going to do if we don't meet with them.
So I could just step in here for a minute, Lisa. So this right now, it's the test case for purpose of the environmental review. And the reason it's done like this is because there's not a specific site-specific project currently proposed. That's my understanding for this test case area. I'm not sure whether the owner has been, involved at all or commented on, what might be an appropriate proposal as part of the test case, but ultimately it'll be up to them to come up with whatever type of development they want to do. So if it's something that falls, there's going to be certain thresholds in the town board's review. And this is not, I don't believe this is in here, but just as an example, say they said the building could only be 30 feet high. So that's something that would be the limit that was studied. So if they wanted to build above that, that would trigger additional seeker review. But as Jeff had mentioned earlier, that if everything's covered by what was studied as far as the environmental impacts, then they'd be able to come, they still have to come to you for site plan approval. I don't know whether any subdivisions would be triggered, but what would have already been resolved would have been that environmental review, so long as they stay within those thresholds.
Okay, that's good that we differentiate that, because I was under the impression that if the CCR floating zone went through, that all of this was approved. It sounded as if there was no other mechanisms to, check and balance this stuff. And like, we're looking at something that looks like this is what's probably going to be proposed. And yet if the developer, if this was just put on paper for us to have a discussion, the developer has no idea it's even here. They're not.
I'm not sure whether, and I don't know, Jeff, if you know anything about.
So I can speak to that a little bit. So think of this merely as an example, Lisa, of what could be done. Yeah. And it's an example of what could be done on the test case site. And there's all kinds of other sites throughout the town of Monroe that could conceivably come before the board asking for this designation. Maybe nobody will. Maybe a number of them will. Maybe nobody will ever. You have to remember, the town could adopt this and everyone could look at it and go, yeah, you know what? I don't want to do it that way. It's an option for developers. It gives them another option. But this is merely an example, and it was an example created for us to have something tangible to look at in the environmental process. Could a developer then, after this is all published, come in and look at that, land and decide, I want to buy that land and I want to build that concept. I love that concept and I think I can, make a nice tidy profit off of that. Could they come back to the town and say, we want to do this? They could, but they're going to want to, most likely they're going to want to do it their own way. They're going to have their own concept. So,
right.
My concern was we'll see something different, but this gives us a common talking point, if you will, at this stage of the game.
I understand that it's conceptual and stuff like that. It just seems like I was under the impression that if the CCR goes through, which we're just going to give our statements on how we feel about it, but it's really up to the town board to decide if they want to adopt this new zoning. But I was under the impression that if the town board actually adopted the CCR floating zone as a zoning, that this would all go through. So that's why I'm asking these questions. But that is not the case then. I mean, because if they have conditional final on these projects, Shea Meadow, if they have conditional final and then we go and change the zoning, they should have to come back to us, or they should have to come back to somebody, because now they're not going to be building 46 lots. They're going to be building you know, as we're looking at this model, they're going to be building differently. So that's my concern was it made it sound through our discussion that it seems as if the CCR gets approved by the town board as a new way to zone, that the test case has already been approved. And that's, I mean, I think it's misleading. It's not.
It hasn't been approved. It's only got, it's that it still has to go through the planning board process. We would
Okay,
review
that's
the
good to
site
know.
plan. It still had the CCR being landed on that site would still have to be done by the town board. The only thing that would be done already would be the environmental review, again, assuming it doesn't exceed those limits.
Okay.
That's the only
Okay.
thing on that piece of property that the developer wouldn't have to go through. But every other aspect of planning and approvals, they would have to go through.
Okay, thank you.
Valid concern.
Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah. Anthony? Test case?
I don't have any comments now. I appreciate everybody else's though.
John?
Just one comment about the traffic. You know, I don't think we've taken a look at the traffic studies for those couple of developments that were already granted conditional final approval. You know, I think the one was Shea Meadow, and there might have been another one in that area. But as far as traffic, you know, again, I'm gonna play that devil's advocate and say development's going to happen over there.
Yep.
So traffic is going to happen also. So I think what we need to do is look at the incremental change in traffic between what could be built there in either scenario, instead of looking at the traffic changes versus nothing happening there, because the only way nothing is going to happen there is if you or I hit the mega millions for several $100 million and buy it and just let it sit there. So it's going to happen, and there's going to be traffic. And, you know, let's keep in mind that the study shows proposed traffic for just the test case floating zone, and it doesn't show it for the test case floating zone versus the alternative.
Yeah, and I didn't have enough of a sense from the traffic portion whether it looked at that. There's a lot of portions where it looks at the no build alternative, the traditional build alternative, or this build alternative. And, you know, maybe between now and our meeting on the 9th, we can all, you know, take some consideration of that, particularly around traffic, which is a hot button topic on this, enough for most of us that it warrants some further consideration. I think, unless anyone has anything that they really want to include tonight, what I would ask the board to do is, based on your, you know, review up to tonight and based on what we've discussed, if you could write down and compile your thoughts, pro and con, and your concerns, and most importantly, the questions that you would like to feed back to. Remember, as part of any questions that are asked must be addressed in the final GEIS, either in the body of it or separately at the bottom. Basically, you come across all these questions where they say, yep, that wasn't considered. That's worthy of consideration. This is the answer to that. That's the answer to this. You know, on a big project, there could be hundreds of pages of those types of questions. And they may say to your question, yep, the answer to that question is found in the body of the FGIS in this section. Look at this, and that's the answer to your question. But any questions that we pose as a group now get to be part of that final study. So I think it's well worth our time. I think we've obviously given this a good amount of thought. I have to tell everyone, I appreciate so much the time that you put in to thinking about this and consideration of the different aspects. I'm really, really happy with tonight's discussion, personally. And again, I'm appreciative of the time that you put in for this. I hope the members of the public who joined us found this somewhat educating. If you can take those written comments and funnel them to Ashley, then we can work with those to start to streamline our conversation for the ninth. We can kind of, look at what everybody's thoughts are, put together a framework, and then we can kind of talk through that framework on the ninth to come up with what truly we'd like to express to the town board. Does that make sense, Ashley?
That'd be great.
Okay. So let's, in all fairness, try and give Ashley a little time to look at those. If we can try and get those to her by what's the Sunday before the ninth? Anyone know? I'm really bad with dates. Let's see. That would be the 5th. Let's try and get them to her by the night of the 5th so she can start looking at those on the 6th, 7th, and 8th. And maybe she and I can have a little conversation in there too, so that we can be ready to be as productive and efficient as possible on the 9th. Anybody got anything else?
Can they be the questions we already asked? I mean, I know we discussed a lot.
Yeah,
but-
it should include all those questions. All the good questions that have been brought up tonight, all the good points that have been brought up tonight. But again, like you said, we all may take time to now delve back into the documents, and we may get further questions, and we'll absolutely consider everything from tonight and everything that you'd like to consider.
So then on the meeting that we're having in April 9th, are we going to then decide as a group what questions we want to present to the town board?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, we're gonna try and just streamline it all, because we've been together for the better part of what, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, so right, we want our document to be efficient for the town board and workable, but we want it to be comprehensive at the same time. So with that, if I could get a motion to end our meeting this evening. Anybody left not on mute? All right. I'd like to make a motion to end our meeting this evening, and reconvene this conversation on April 9th. If I may have a second.
I'll second.
No.
I'll second.
I think that was Jason with the second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? Okay, our meeting is dismissed. Thank you again for all your time tonight. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Jeff.
Good night.
You did a good job. Thanks, Jeff. Good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Be well.